Clemson has been in the college football playoff discussion really every year since we've had the college football playoff, or at least the last several years. And so it's hard to imagine them not being in that playoff discussion once again in 2021. But we're going to look at the worst case scenario, what could potentially happen to Clemson that's going to make them struggle and have the worst year that they possibly could have. And then I'll tell you what I think that is. All right, so we're going to start with the quarterback here, DJ Uiagalelei. It is so important that he stays healthy because they don't have a lot of depth, don't really have any experience behind him. If he were to go down, and I think he's the only guy that they cannot lose. I mean, you look at every other position for Clemson, there's talent, there's depth. I'm not really concerned about one guy. You know, if you lose your top two offensive linemen, obviously that's going to be a big deal. But if we're talking about one player, DJ Uiagalelei, he is the guy that has to stay healthy. If they're going to have a great year, he will have to stay healthy. But let's say he gets hurt, and then all of a sudden you're talking about the worst case scenario for Clemson, and I think that's number one. You cannot have him get injured, so they need to protect him. Also, can they fill the holes on the offensive line? So let's say they can't fill the holes on the offensive line. That again would be another part of the worst case scenario for Clemson. They lose a couple of guys. You lose Jackson Carman, you lose Cade Stewart. They're going to look to some youngsters to step in there on the offensive line. But what if they don't? What if they're not ready? You know, you talk about a guy like Tristan Lay, expected to be a great player in the future, but will he be ready as a true freshman? That's going to be a question. Then we're also talking about that center position. That is a very important position on the offensive line. So filling those holes on the offensive line, getting production from the newcomers on the offensive line going to be very important. But if they can't do that, I think the offense overall will struggle. And speaking of the offense, I think you also look at the worst case scenario here with no balance on offense. I think the passing game is going to be there for Clemson. I'm not too concerned about it with all these receivers coming back. And DJ, an experienced guy now. Again, if he stays healthy, the passing game should be fine. But what if they can't run the football? What if they can't find that balance? You know, DJ's not a guy that's going to give you a lot in the run game, less than Trevor Lawrence. So if they get one-dimensional and they have to throw, I think that's really going to be bad news for Clemson. You kind of saw that a little bit against Notre Dame last year in the first meeting. They've got to stay balanced on offense. You cannot be one-dimensional and have a great year. So we're going to say that worst case scenario is they don't really find a run game. They don't really have balance on offense. And overall, with that offensive line struggling as well, you see this Clemson team struggle in 2021. So that's worst case scenario on offense. What about the defense? I think the defense it's simply about the secondary. If the secondary struggles, this team is going to struggle overall. This defense is going to struggle. We saw it against Ohio State. Obviously, they did not play great in that game. And you lose Darian Kendrick. You know, that's a big loss. He transferred out of there. They've got guys. I mean, they've got talent coming back. But is there enough depth in the secondary to where you can say for sure that Clemson's going to be really good in the secondary? That's a question mark for me. You know, Andrew Booth, I think, is right there on the verge of being a great player. I think, you know, he has a chance to be an All-American type player. You've got him. You've got Mario Goodrich back. You've got Sheridan Jones. You know, talented players. But again, depth might be a bit of an issue for them. Nolan Turner back at safety. That's big for them. Landon Zanders, he played pretty well for them last year. So again, you look at the starters, they should be pretty good. But what if you have some injuries in the secondary? What if the depth's not there? Again, if that secondary struggles, as good as the defensive line should be, you know, if the defensive line doesn't dominate and the secondary struggles a little bit, I think the Clemson defense overall struggles, and that is going to be a big problem for them. So they need that secondary to really step up and not get them to this worst case scenario. So what is the worst case scenario for Clemson? Last year they were 10-2. They lost 2 games and had a chance. You know, a lot of people thought they were going to win the national championship last year. They were in the playoff, but didn't make it. So you look ahead to 2021, and again, what is the worst case scenario for this team? Well, when you look at the schedule, you know, you've got several games. Even if all these things happen, if DJ gets hurt, if they can't run the football, the offensive line struggles, secondary struggles, this team is still too talented to lose to almost anyone on their schedule. Now, Georgia, obviously, they're not going to beat Georgia. If they get the worst case scenario, like we talked about, they're not going to beat Georgia. And then you got some other games here that could be tricky. NC State on the road, Boston College, who played them tough last year, Pittsburgh, Louisville on the road. These are games that could be a bit of a challenge. You know, I didn't include Florida State in here because it's at home, but Florida State could be a different team this year with a lot of transfers coming in. But what's your worst case scenario? Obviously, Georgia would be a loss in the worst case scenario. I think other than that, maybe you get upset somewhere because upsets do happen. And I'm just going to randomly pick a team and then pick NC State. But to me, worst case scenario really is 10-2 for Clemson. And that is, again, if DJ Uiagalelei gets hurt, if they can't run the football, if the offensive line struggles and the secondary struggles, if everything goes against them, I still think their worst case scenario is 10 wins. I mean, that's as bad as it's going to get for Clemson because of how good this team is. Now, I really don't see them losing to NC State, to be honest. I really could even say the worst case is 11-2. But the ACC championship could be a loss for them. So I would say a more realistic worst case scenario would be 11-1 and then losing in the ACC championship to not make it into the college football playoff. That's probably a more realistic worst case scenario. And that's not saying that everything's going to go against them, but things kind of go against them a little bit. You don't have to have all four of the things that I mentioned, but maybe they can't run the football, the offensive line struggles, something like that. They could lose to Miami or North Carolina in the ACC championship. So to me, just looking at the worst case, if things go as we expect them to go, worst case really is a second loss in the ACC championship. It would really take a disastrous season for Clemson to lose 2 regular season games, and that's saying a lot. I mean, imagine having your worst case scenario. Imagine having everything go against you, and you still finish with 10 wins. So that's how good Clemson, I think, can be and will be in 2021. And it's also just the schedule. It's also just showing you how easy this schedule is. NC State could be a pretty good team. Pitt could be a decent team. Florida State could be decent. Boston College could be a top 25 team. There are games on the schedule, and that's again why I say you could slip up, you could get upset somewhere. But Clemson is going to be an overwhelming favorite, I think, in every game that they play except for Georgia. So worst case for them is 1 or 2 losses, and I would honestly be surprised if they lost 2 games in the regular season. I would be very surprised. So worst case again for Clemson, 10-2 in 2021. Do you think they could do even worse than that? Do you agree with this? Do you disagree? Give me your thoughts down in the comments below.